I'm actually speaking to you tonight from the Aveyron, somewhat further away, I think, than I would be if I had happened to be speaking to you from Cambridge. So today I want to explore some of the connections between the use of archaeology and the emergence of nationalism and national identities at that cusp, if you like, when African nations transition from being part of a European colony to being fully independent nation states. And I want to pick up on some of the themes that have been explored in other studies of the links between archaeology and nationalism. But I also want to highlight some of the areas where I think there are some interesting differences. And my final introductory sort of observation would be that relative to other parts of the world, and especially Europe, there has been only limited research on the links between archaeology and nationalism and national identity in sub-Saharan Africa. I will mention some key classic studies over the course of this presentation, but I think there's still an awful lot more work to be done. And I, in a sense, in preparing this talk, I both discovered my own ignorance about some of the circumstances that led to independence in different African nation states and the main players in these and the networks that they created between themselves, although I was familiar with some of those. And in a way, I think probably the next step is actually to bring in political scientists and historians into a discussion in which we engage with them and try and explore a little bit more about what the past meant for these early the founders of the various nation states and these liberation leaders in some cases. In others, they were already active within politics within the colony, but had attained positions of prominence that when the moment of independence came, they seemed to be the logical leader to take over the reins of power. So just to, sorry, I'm going to have to master how I move on. There we go. There we go. So just to give you an overview of the presentation today, I'm going to, first of all, take a look at very, very basically and very generally at the links between archaeology and nationalism, particularly in relationship to the rise of the nation state in Europe in the 19th century. And I will give you a brief and very potted and hugely simplified overview of some of the links that, for example, can be drawn between archaeology and the construction of a particular form of French nationalism. And then mention briefly abuses of the past in Europe with reference to the rise of the Nazi Party. And then I want to move away from Europe, but I want to use this as a context, if you like, against which I think that we need to consider whether the same trajectories are followed, the same forces are in play when we come to considering the links between archaeology and nationalism in sub-Saharan Africa, or whether something there's some difference. And that's why I've put these images of two banknotes. The bottom one is a 1,000 drachma banknote from Greece, and you can see what might be a Doric, or it may be a Corinthian, I don't know, can't quite see on that, but certainly a Greek temple and some statues there, and some coins at the bottom, all sort of being, these are monuments and artifacts from the past that are being appropriated by the nation state and inserted on its national currency. And we see the same thing happening on the $50 note. That's quite old now. That was probably in circulation when I was living and teaching in Botswana, and it would have probably, got you a reasonable way. Today, that $50 would be virtually worthless, unfortunately, because of the hyperinflation that Zimbabwe suffered. But leave that aside, we can see in the center of the image a picture of the interior of Great Zimbabwe with the very famous conical tower at the very center of that image. Looking at the screen now to your right, you will see a depiction of one of the soapstone birds, the battler eagles, that were found at the site and were taken away from the site by Europeans. Some have subsequently been repatriated to Zimbabwe. And below the image of the stone enclosure, there is also that a chevron pattern that references, if you like, some of the decorative stonework that you see around the very top of the wall. If you see the very tall wall behind the conical tower, on the other side of that, there is decorative stonework in a chevron pattern that is reproduced, if you like, in a simplified way at the bottom of the note. And as importantly, of course, this newly emerging nation state that had previously been known as Southern Rhodesia and then Rhodesia became named Zimbabwe. And the state then is again tying itself very overtly to the past within this territory. Zimbabwe is the Shona word for stone-walled enclosures. There are many Zimbabwes. There are very many stone-walled enclosures within the territories of the modern nation state of Zimbabwe, but they extend beyond the territories of Zimbabwe as well. So you find these particular types of archaeological sites also in Botswana and in Mozambique, possibly just across the border in South Africa as well. So that in itself is something that I think we need to unpick as well as we move forward. But before I dig down into presenting in sketchy overview, I'd have to say, how some of the first independent leaders in Africa used the past and referenced the past in their construction of these new identities, these new national identities. I need to set the scene for at least some of you in terms of how the past was conceived and portrayed prior to independence. So I will talk a little bit about the idea of the African continent being a continent without history that gets deeply embedded within European consciousness in the 19th century. It is not there prior to that. It is certainly a 19th century invention, this idea that the continent has no history. And then I'll look at the colonial origins of archaeology in sub-Saharan Africa, the implications that might also have for understanding the particular way in which nationalist leaders might evoke the past in their construction of new identities. And then having looked at some of the political statements of two key leaders, I'm just going to focus on Kwame Nkrumah and President Nyerere of Tanzania. Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana, because I think their uses of the past are, at least in the Anglophone world, are quite explicit. I know that we could draw some examples from Francophone Africa, and I'll make some brief reference to some of those as well. And then I want to conclude by asking, well, given the importance that early independence leaders across Africa laid on the need to recuperate and recover Africa's history, to expose the history that had been denied by and large by European colonialists. And given the power of archaeology of providing a deep time perspective on that diverse and complex history, why is it that archaeology today still struggles to gain some trackhold in national consciousness in the majority of sub-Saharan African states? Perhaps we shouldn't say that this is a universal view. So just shifting then back to this issue of nationalism, and I'm sure that this is really rehashing things that many of you are undoubtedly aware of. But I think it's quite important to think about how archaeologists began to think about the links between archaeology and nationalism. It's becomes quite a popular theme, a popular research topic, really from the sort of late 1980s, early 1990s. And a number of different studies get published, not just in English, but in other European languages during this period. We see, for example, in Germany, a detailed exploration, obviously because of its hugely problematic and traumatic history with the rise of National Socialism and the misuse of the past by the Nazis. But in the 1980s and 1990s, German archaeologists and historians begin sort of quite sustained research on this topic. And we see it also cropping up in other fields. And this is one of those early composite edited volumes that sort of marks the beginnings, or not the beginnings, but the sort of the fluorescence, if you like, of research on the links between nationalism, politics, and the practice of archaeology. And in their editorial introduction to this book, Philip Cole and Claire Fawcett make a number of important points that I think it's just worth us reminding ourselves. First of all, nationalism requires the elaboration of either a real or an invented past. But of course, that's a selective use of the past. It's not the past in its entirety. There are certain elements of the past that serve nationalism's interests, but not all elements of the past. They also highlight that, of course, the relationship between archaeology and nationalism is not static. It's shifting all the time. And we can make a broad distinction, and this is just a very coarse distinction, I think, that we would want to, probably by the end of this seminar series, you would have a much more nuanced sense of how this relationship has changed and how it's remained the same. But of course, in its, at least in the European context, as archaeology began to emerge as a distinct profession and as a discipline, a formal discipline, it was quite closely linked to the rise of nationalism, as we'll talk a little bit later in a moment. Today, however, probably most European archaeologists would be more cautious about tying their archaeology to any form of a nationalist agenda. We'd be much more critical of the use of the past to support nationalist agendas, and we might be more want to argue much more for a polycentric construction of the past and a multivocal one as well. So it's important to keep that in mind, I think, as we progress. And by the same token, of course, nationalism takes many different forms. So the way in which the past is always going to be different according to the context. We might, I think, still nonetheless say that there are some particular characteristics about nationalist archaeology that distinguishes it from other phases of archaeological research. And for some of you, you may well be familiar of a paper that Bruce Trigger published almost 40 years ago, in which he categorize different the if you like, the political influences on archaeology and how that shaped the way in which the archaeological record is interpreted into three broad types: nationalist archaeology, colonialist archaeology, and imperialist archaeology. And his imperialist archaeology writing at the time in the 1980s was really very much contrasting the model of archaeology that was practiced within the Eastern Bloc, if you like, with the processualist archaeology that dominated at least Anglo-American interpretive circles, if not necessarily in the non-English speaking part of the West. Those categories, I think, still hold, but of course today we would add additional categories such as indigenous archaeology. A key point that I want to make, however, is that the transition between these is not necessarily linear. If we think of European archaeology, it emerges within the context of rising European nationalism and the creation and the formation of European nation states, a breaking away from the ties with an older elite, the older sort of aristocracy, if you like, and their control over power. And archaeology, as we'll see in a minute, helps serve those interests. But then we see a transition of archaeology more into what Trigger might, at least in 1984, I think is when he's writing, have referred to as a Western imperialist view of archaeology. It's not entirely a universalizing view, but perhaps it's moving more towards that perspective. If we look at the sub-Saharan Africa, the trajectory is different. Archaeology is born within the context of colonialism, and the earliest forms of archaeology and archaeological interpretations of the archaeological record of sub-Saharan Africa are very much shaped by this social and political context. So there's less emphasis, for example, in those early interpretations on indigenous innovation. That change comes about from within the African societies. Change in many of those early archaeologies of sub-Saharan Africa is seen as coming from outside. We'll get to reasons why that might be. So again, there's a difference between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, and that might also explain some of the ways in which archaeology was mobilized to support nationalist agendas, but might also explain why its prominence within a discourse about the nation and the discourse about national identity seems to have faded somewhat. So I've said this many times already. I have a tendency perhaps to repeat myself, so I won't dwell too heavily on this observation, but really just to emphasize that archaeology emerged very much as a distinct discipline at a time of considerable political change within the 19th century. And there is, as Margarita Diaz-Andreu has explored in great depth, a real sort of reciprocal relationship between archaeology and nationalist politics. That said, and she would also make this point, it was often, initially at least, the historians who had a much more prominent role. We can certainly see this in the case of France, for example, where it's historians, French historians, who are the first to, if you like, link French identity to a more distant past. As various authors, including Alain Schnapp, Michael Dietler, and Margarita Diaz-Andreu again, have all demonstrated the incorporation of antiquities and works of art into the construction of French identity from the 18th century and into the 19th century is an amalgam, if you like. They're drawing partly on or trying to link France to the achievements, if you like, of the classical world and of ancient Egypt as well, seeing some kind of linear connection between the populace of France and the inhabitants of those areas. It certainly is something that motivates Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and the well-known scientific expedition that accompanied this, that brought many of Egypt's antiquities to France, and also motivated the creation of a number of important institutions devoted to the study and the presentation of the past in France. But it's Thierry's Histoire des Gaulois, which really sort of is the first text, if you like, and maybe you can correct me, but that's my understanding of what other scholars have said, that pushes France's sort of identity further back into the past by linking that identity with the Celts and particularly with Vercingetorix. And Napoleon III is somewhat instrumental in this, embedding this idea that our ancestors are the Gauls, if you like. He was very much I misspelled him as well. He was an admirer of Julius Caesar, and he actually supported research aimed at finding the site of Alesia, this famous battle. But there was more concerned actually with finding Caesar's siege works than the associated Iron Age Celtic remains, the hill fort, etc. Nonetheless, he ends up sponsoring, if you like, the erection of this famous statue of Vercingetorix and at the bottom of this statue, I think this is really the key issue here, that there is this inscription: "United Gaul in a single nation, fired by a single spirit, can defy the world." And it is, if you like, Vercingetorix's resistance to Caesar that Napoleon III begins to see as something something that makes him an early hero, if you like, of the nation state. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, this idea has certainly not disappeared. So here we have two somewhat similar quotes, one from 1870s from Ernest Lévy, and the other made in 2017 by the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. Both, if you like, saying that there is, even if you, as Sarkozy himself, who has both Hungarian and Algerian ancestry, if you don't necessarily have to have been born in France, but you, by being French, by being a citizen of France, this earlier history becomes, the Gauls become your ancestors, as well as those who have long lineages of having been born and lived within the territorial boundaries of the nation state. So this link between the past and national identity, I think that the point that I would draw from this can be very tenacious and long-living. And of course, you see this on the slide, of course, that something that kind of contradicts this view once you dig down into the factual evidence. I'm sure you're all extremely familiar also with the misappropriation of the past with the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s. I'm not going to really dwell on this. I'm sure it will be covered much more effectively by other speakers in your series. But I'd just like you to just make a note if you like. Sorry, I've not advanced my screen. There we go. I'd just like you to make a note of this quote that is attributed to Heinrich Himmler at the top of the screen. And just try to keep in mind exactly what is being said there. Because we will come across statements that are remarkably similar, but were made by people who did not hold the same sort of racist views and idea of being a member of a superior race that Himmler had. So he's attributed of saying, and I've been trying to track down the source for this, and I still have to establish this, and maybe Bettina Arnold would be the person to talk to. A nation lives happily in the present and the future so long as it is aware of its past and the greatness of its ancestors. So just keep that particular point in your mind. Okay, well, enough of Europe for the time being, although we don't completely escape Europe. What I want to now shift to is the constructs of the African past that dominated in sub-Saharan Africa during the colonial era. And if you can just let me pause one moment, I've got to let a cat out. Thank you very much. Essentially, and again, it is a gross overgeneralization, because if we look at the work and the writings of various colonial officials, English, French, Belgian, German, Italian even, we certainly find more positive ideas and understandings of Africa's past among some of them. But in a general sense, there was this sort of broad assumption that Africa's history really only began with the arrival of Europeans. And of course, part of that reason for thinking in that way is because, of course, Africans recorded their history through oral traditions. So orality rather than the text was the primary means of communicating and passing on knowledge of the past. And Europeans, accustomed as they were to the authority of the text, because literacy is relatively late in the majority of sub-Saharan African countries, fell into this really very easy assumption that because there were no written texts going back, written by Africans going back into the distant past, it's really only once Europeans are present and are writing things down that history begins. And this is a very sort of Hegelian, if you like, notion of what is history. And it's epitomized really in the work of a very prominent British historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, who was certainly a public intellectual when he was at his height in the UK. And these quotes come from, I think it's his second lecture in a series of 8 lectures that he gave on the BBC, the Wreath Lectures, that were published then in a magazine that the BBC used to publish called The Listener. That's no longer published as far as I'm aware. But they were talks that were broadcast over the radio. And he's talking about sort of historical traditions and historiography and the practice of history. And he makes these observations that undergraduates are always demanding for to be taught the history of Black Africa. And then he's quite disparaging in a sense. But at present, there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. And if he'd stopped there and said, and this is because of our way of understanding history, it would have been fine. But instead, he goes on and saying that the rest is largely darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. So he's evoking this trope, if you like, of Africa being a dark continent that emerges also in the 19th century. And elsewhere, he talks about the teaching of history somewhat being rather pointless, because there is only the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque, irrelevant corners of the globe. And that quote has become infamous, if you like, and it rapidly became infamous in the early 1960s, because this was at a moment when more African countries had attained independence, and they were establishing their own universities, their own departments of history. They were all colleges, university colleges that had been established prior to independence became fully independent universities. This is the moment when we, if you like, when we see African history as a field really being born. And this first generation of historians of Africa are all very, very much taken. And here we really have to thank, amongst others, but people like Jan van Sina, for having recognized the power of oral history and the temporal depth of history, oral history. And so we see in the 1960s the emergence of a new generation of African scholars trained in the disciplinary practices of history, but using a different kind of source than their European counterparts, drawing much more heavily on the oral histories and collecting those. And often you find this quote from Trevor Roper being used time and time again as a rallying call, if you like, for this new field, this new discipline. And it's quite interesting, if you're thinking about the history of archaeology on the African continent, that this moment is also when we see a certain shift in emphasis in African archaeology away from a preoccupation with the Stone Age and human origins, although that continues certainly, and a widening of perspectives to look at the archaeology of more recent times, the archaeology that might relate to the direct ancestors of modern day populations. And particularly we see from this period also this beginnings of this great debate about the emergence of Bantu languages and their subsequent expansion across vast areas of sub-Saharan Africa, the splitting into hundreds of different Bantu languages, the different streams between Western and Eastern Stream Bantu, and the possible correlations between the spread of farming and the spread of the knowledge of iron metallurgy. Things some of you, I'm sure, are undoubtedly very familiar with. But it's this denial of history that I want to emphasize. This is the context in which early the first generation of independent leaders grew up, if you like, and were reacting against. At the same time, as I've already indicated, what archaeology was going on the continent was very strongly colonial in focus. As I mentioned earlier, this idea that innovation was driven from outside, and often in those interpretations, there was an emphasis on population migration, to a lesser extent, diffusion. And I think that's really because the idea of diffusion, cultural diffusion, had already begun to be questioned quite considerably within European and North American archaeology at that time. But migration, population migration, aligned this idea of population migration as being a source of innovation on the continent, I think also aligned with what the first generation of African historians were telling, in that they were recounting these oral histories that were often about the processes of migration that led to the eventual occupation of a particular territory by this or that ethnic community. Those oral histories often tell about, they're framed in a way in which the founder of the ethnicity, if you like, has children or brothers, sometimes sisters who break away, or sisters' sons maybe, who break away and split, and there's all of this sort of splitting off, hiving off, and moving to new territory. And that fits well into an idea that migration is the primary driver of change on the African continent, but it's still a very colonial one, and quite Eurocentric in some of the way in which the past was understood. Yeah, we have this odd paradox, of course, is that archaeology is a way of actually recovering unwritten past and providing an alternative frame, an alternative understanding and interpretation of these oral histories. I think that, the classic example, and again, apologies for bringing it up for those who no doubt are very familiar with it, but this is there perhaps for those of you who are less familiar with the historiography of African archaeology. The classic example of this sort of kind of colonial view, if you like, relates to the long history of misinterpretation of Great Zimbabwe, from when it was first encountered by Europeans in the late 19th century, through into at least the middle of the early part of the 20th century. The interpretations were always that this fantastic monument, an amazing construction in dry stone walling, an elaborate decoration of the walls covering a very significant area of land, could not have been built by Black Africans, that they were just technologically incapable of doing this. And so these early European explorers, treasure hunters, and sort of, incipient archaeologists, that's the best we can call them, evoke all sorts of foreigners as having established Great Zimbabwe. And it's really only from about 1911 that we begin to see this narrative being challenged by more systematic archaeological research. Initially by Randall McIver, who works there in 1911, and subsequently by Gertrude Catherine Thompson, who is working there in the late 1920s. And she argues quite fundamentally that nothing that she found on the site suggests anything other than the site is of Bantu origin. She doesn't really, because she doesn't have radiocarbon available to her at the time, the technique has not been developed, she doesn't get the date of the origins of Great Zimbabwe right, but she does conceive of the site as being of African origin. She's not entirely free of racist views. There are parts of her text that are quite derogatory about both the finds and the quality of the pottery, and by implication the society. But she feels adamantly that this is an African site. But these ideas that Africans just simply could not make a monument of such splendor, if you like, are deeply rooted within the settler community and also within South African academics. And there's a very famous coverage of the Catherine Thompson's presentation of her results, her first presentation of her results in Johannesburg after she's completed her field work. And this is an academic meeting, and it's attended by Professor Raymond Dart, who'd already established his name as somebody who, a discoverer of Australopithecines, and a very prominent South African intellectual at that time, who is outraged, as you see from the quote at the bottom, in large quote that comes from this report in the Cape Times of August the 3rd, 1929. He's outraged that Captain Tomlinson is even making this kind of suggestion. So it's an idea that is really quite deeply embedded within the settler community in both what was then Southern Rhodesia and also South Africa. And in addition to that, underlying this is a much older myth that really took root in the latter part of the 19th century amongst white South African settlers, both Boer and British settlers, that prior to the arrival of Europeans on the Cape, with Van Riebeck's landing, most of the interior of Southern Africa was an empty land. It was unoccupied. And this, of course, this idea gives a fundamental justification to European colonialism, because if the land is unoccupied, then anybody has a right, if you like, to settle there and to colonize it. And enmeshed within this idea of this being an unoccupied land are both a number of misconceptions. One is a misconception about the antiquity of the presence of Bantu language speakers, particularly in the eastern and central part of South Africa. That, we see here this gentleman here, Holden. He was one of the sort of W.C. Holden was one of the first to sort of perpetuate this view in his book on the past and future of the Kaffir races, published in 1866, arguing that yes, there are Bantu-speaking populations in these territories, but they arrive more or less at the same time as Europeans, and the rest of the land is empty. Another idea of this being an empty land, of course, is that as you move further into the interior, settled agriculture with permanent settlements is not a viable livelihood strategy. So we see indigenous populations either relying on mobile hunter-gathering or mobile pastoralism, and they're not making permanent settlements. So the idea of if you don't see any permanent villages within the European imagination, this is an unoccupied land. But we know, of course, that this was completely inaccurate. So it's against these kinds of contexts, and this is really my point of laboring those colonial constructions of Africa's pre-colonial past, which again, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It is against this context in which the first generation of African leaders emerge. And if you look at the writings of the majority of them, there is a frequent reference to a need to regain, as here we have this quote from Amilcar Cabral, to regain the historical personality of that people, to return its history through the disruption of the imperialist domination to which it was subject, to recover a silenced past, if you like. But of course, these are noble sentiments, but of course it raises the whole issue of what kind of history and whose history. And many of the early independence leaders and first generation of leaders of African nations, when they're writing about this, also emphasize that this history needs to be rooted in indigenous ontologies, indigenous African understandings of the world, and one also that recognizes and acknowledges the agency of Africans in shaping their own historical destiny. But of course, that creates in itself a little bit of a dilemma because of the legacies of European colonialism that have in itself created or manipulated ethnic identities as part of their exercise of colonial rule. And from a Belgian perspective, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of the history of Rwanda and the elevation of Tutu as an aristocracy within Belgian histories and archaeologies of the colony, to the detriment, as we know, to a large part of the Rwanda's population with the genocide in 1994. Just before I look a little bit more detail at Nkrumah and Nyerere, I just want to flag up a couple of other quotes. Again, many of you may be familiar with Seretse Khama's quote. He makes it at the opening of the University of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland, as it was called. And he writes, of course, we should write our own history books to prove that we did have a past, and that it was a past that was just as worth writing and learning about as any other. It goes on to argue we must do this for the simple reason that a nation without a past is a lost nation, and a people without a past are a people without a soul. And I asked you just to keep in mind those words that are attributed to Heinrich Himmler earlier in this talk. And if you juxtapose those words with Seretse Khama's words, there's not an awful lot of difference. But of course, the trajectory is very different. We don't see Khama using the past and misusing the past to exercise, to implement genocide on part of its population, as might have been done, for example, by somebody else, although I like to think not. But I just want to sort of, the reason I'm trying to juxtapose those things is I think that we have to dig below these kinds of observations and see what else is at work, what else is motivating this reference to the recovery of history and the role of the past in creating a nation in, a nation state, a new identity that is founded on a territory. And this brings me to the next point, really, that I want to make, and has often been made by others, is that within the African context, the links between the past and ideas of a national identity actually sort of take two rather different forms. And we see it being played out rather differently in different nation states. There are those contexts where there is very much an emphasis on territorial nationalism. And this is an idea of creating a new identity in the inherited geographical space that is inherited from the colonizing power. This is a geographical space that typically, around its borders, cuts through the territories, if you like, or the lands of pre-existing ethnic groups, pre-existing identities. And this is exactly the case with Zimbabwe. You may recall I mentioned earlier that Zimbabwe's, these stone-walled enclosures, are not restricted to the nation state of Zimbabwe. They're found in adjacent nation states because that was the geographical extent of the Zimbabwe Empire, as we call it, that ancient nation state or empire that pre-existed before the colonial period. And we can find this anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are those political leaders who focus very much on the territorial nationalism. And their challenge is, how do you create a sense of a shared past in a geographical territory that is extremely heterogeneous in terms of its ethnicities and the languages, and even the relations and interactions between those communities prior to the establishment of European colonialism over those territories. Then there are other leaders who, from the very beginning or subsequently during their political careers, embrace some form of Pan-Africanism. And the classic examples of the use of or the linking of archaeology and history to some Pan-African ideal, if you like, really is found, I think, very much in the works of Leopold Senghor and Cheikh Anta Diop, Senegalese. Leopold Senghor and Cheikh Anta Diop were both Senegalese scholars as well as politicians, and they both emphasized the Pan-African component of the past, and we'll see a little bit on that. As I keep stressing, I think Zimbabwe provides a really clear example of a more overt use of the past in the support of territorial nationalism. But intriguingly also that they continue the use of some of the symbols that were already present on official insignia, flags, banknotes, emblems of the Air Force, for example, and so forth, that were already present during the colonial period, both during the British colonial period and the Smiths UDI regime against which the War of Independence was fought. And I think this is just to bring home this point about the branding of the nation, and it's very explicit and increasingly sort of escalating or appropriation of this symbology, if you like, by other organs of the state and businesses and other entities within the modern nation state. There's a recent paper, I think, that's going to be coming out in the journal Social Archaeology, maybe next year, in which this sort of, this argument that Zimbabwe today is awash with these kinds of symbols of the past. Everybody is using elements from Great Zimbabwe in their branding of their identity. Whereas, as I mentioned, particularly in Anta Diop's writing, we see a rather different approach. This is an approach where the histories of their territories are linked to the histories of Egypt and ancient Egyptian civilization. And Anta Diop is quite explicit. I mean, his argument develops that, well, if humankind emerged in East Africa at the time, that seemed to be particularly a prominent view, and I think it'd be one that we would still say the archaeology and paleoanthropology largely supports, although not just the East Africa. That these groups would have then dispersed across the wider continent, including populating areas of the Sahara and the Nile Valley. Don't think he was aware of the African humid period when the Sahara was much wetter than it is now, but again, there's a logic to what he's arguing. And that then these communities then dispersed out of Egypt again. So he gets drawn into, if you like, a diffusionist and migrationist model for understanding change within his own territory. But very much, Anta Diop very much promoted, as I think you can see from the text in the sidebar, an idea of a shared African identity that can trace its roots back to ancient Egyptian civilization. And it's a flawed interpretation in the same way that other diffusionist models are often flawed as well. But it is one that is trying to position African achievements alongside, against some sort of measure, if you like, that the West might take seriously. And this is really, to a certain extent, an element of a lot of the writing of the early Pan-Africanists. They, in trying to recover and to say, look, Africa has a past to be proud of, with as many achievements as we can see in the Mediterranean world, because archaeology was still, at least archaeology of the non-Stone Age eras, was still very much in the infancy at the time they were writing. They looked to ancient Egypt as really as their source of inspiration, of a material signs, if you like, of civilization. Okay, so let's shift focus now and think just a little bit about developments in Ghana and in Tanzania. And the reason I've chosen these two is because there are some interesting links between the political writings of Kwame Nkrumah and those of Nyerere. Nyerere is influenced by Nkrumah, but as importantly, because Ghana is the first sub-Saharan African country to attain independence, they become, if you like, the achievements of the Ghanaians in attaining independence become a model for all of those other aspirant leaders of newly independent nations, including Julius Nyerere. And Nkrumah, I think, from quite an early stage, is a Pan-Africanist. He is, of course, faced with the same problems that Tanzania is faced with, in the sense of trying to unify a geographical space that was then known as the Gold Coast, that where its territorial boundaries cut through the boundaries of pre-existing ethnic populations, particularly the Ewe on the boundary between modern Ghana and Togo, for example. You have Ewe on both sides of that border. It's also a geographical space in which you have quite diverse societies. Obviously, you have the Ashanti and the Ashanti Kingdom, but you also have a number of smaller polities that don't necessarily have the same political structure as a traditional kingdom. But in calling this space Ghana, Nkrumah is definitely situating the history of the people who have occupied this land for generations in the more distant past. Now, the Ghanaian Empire actually had its center much further north, in the boundaries between sort of Mali and Mauritania. So the ancient Ghana, Empire of Ghana's territory did not extend down into the geographical area that is the modern nation state of Ghana. But nonetheless, by naming this new geographical space, Ghana, some reference to that past is being made. But in terms of presenting Ghana's identity, particularly through the newly created National Museum, which is set up relatively soon after independence in 1957. A deliberate choice, it's a deliberate choice. I think we can say it's a deliberate choice, but it's also a choice that perhaps is made easier because of historical circumstances. But a deliberate choice is made in the design of the displays and exhibitions in the National Museum to speak not just to create, to elevate, for example, Ashanti culture above everything else. It gives equal space to Ghana's many different ethnicities, but they're situated within a wider interpretation of the history of West Africa. And that, I think, is really quite important. The the displays speak to a broader West African identity. Yes, you may be now a citizen of Ghana, but you are also part of this wider cultural milieu, cultural set of cultural traditions, shared practices, shared epistemology, shared ontologies. Now, why did I say that this, whilst it was a deliberate strategy in the design of the museum, and there have been some studies undertaken that of the all of the or a lot of the archives associated with this that support it. But why did I say it was also enabled by historical circumstances? And I think a lot has to do with this man, the young Thurston Shaw, who was appointed curator of the Anthropology Museum at Achimota College, which was a college. It was a higher education college to which the sort of Ghanaian elite sent their children during the latter part of the colonial period. And he remained there between 1935 and 1944. And whilst in Ghana, he helped assemble a very diverse collection of material from around Ghana, initiated excavations of different sites in Ghana. And after he had returned to the UK, he still had a very close involvement in the university structure and the establishment of the university. There was originally a university college that was part of the University of London at the time. It was the University College of the Gold Coast that they were, their examination board was the University of London's examination board. It's quite common in British colonies at that time. But there was actually, we see the very first archaeology department south of the Sahara being established in Ghana. There's an earlier one established in Cape Town, but nonetheless, this is for sub-Saharan Africa. This is a particularly foundational exercise. And the museum and the positioning of the material culture into a wider geographical space was something very much central to the teaching of archaeology that Shaw initiated with the establishment of the department at the university, and has been continued ever since, I think, in the University of Ghana. So we see here, this is the buildings at on the Legon campus, the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies, as it's now called, a heritage, I think. But the museum has been a central part of an identity of the archaeology department at Ghana. And one of the interesting things is that, unlike in other parts of the African continent, we have a fully formed archaeology department, an independent archaeology department established from the get-go, rather than it being a subunit within departments of history, as happened, for example, in the situation in Tanzania. So I mentioned Nkrumah had significant influence on Julius Nyerere, and these two quotes, I think, highlight a little bit very clearly, how Ghana's achievement and Nkrumah's achievement of bringing the country to, or taking over as president of a newly independent Ghana, was really inspirational to Nyerere, and I think it's also true to say of many of the other first generation of African leaders as well. I like this bit at the end here, where he's saying, everything had changed. They had changed overnight. They were no longer like us. And that's, I think, really quite interesting, is what Nyerere is saying here in this interview with the journal Africa Now, is that by the very fact that the Ghanaians were now independent, they were somehow different from the rest of us Africans who were still under the colonial yoke. And Nyerere's approach is initially very much one of a territorial nationalism. And central to this territorial nationalism in Nyerire's philosophy were these two concepts of Ujamaa and Kujidikema. So Ujamaa, often translated as African familyhood or socialism, and Kujidikema as self-reliance. And I think you may have seen a little bit earlier, I gave a quote where Nyerere gives an observation about the role of universities. And he had a slightly different educational background prior to becoming Tanzania's first president. Whereas Nkrumah went to study in the US and had very early contact with the Pan-Africanists like Dubois and so forth in the United States, and Black nationalist movements, and Marcus Garvey. He was exposed to these ideas that were more of a Pan-Africanist ilk. Nyerere's education is entirely in the UK, and he comes back to Tanzania and is very concerned to sort of create this nation out of, he has a sense that there was no pre-colonial nation of Tanganyika, and that it is through the promotion, particularly of these concepts, this philosophy of how you live within this space, this shared reciprocal relationships, and also not being dependent on the external world, coupled also with the efforts to promote Swahili as the universal language of Tanzania, I think they're very clear signs of him trying to unify a very fragmented and diverse territorial space. And it's only later in his career that he begins to shift towards a more Pan-Africanist view. And his successes really are very limited. He manages the unification of Zanzibar and Tanganyika into the new nation state of Tanzania. He pushes quite hard for the creation of an East African Union, but that's not something that is supported by either Milton Obote, president of Uganda, or Jomo Kenyatta, president of Kenya. They push back against this idea of and he never brings it to fruition. So his shift towards a Pan-Africanist view is a more gradual one than Nkrumah's. And I think that we see, to some extent, this in a way manifested in the way in which archaeology takes root as an independent discipline in Tanzania. Archaeology is established only as a taught course, really in the mid 1980s at the University of Dar es Salaam. There are some archaeologists who are employed in the history department prior to this, but they don't make much of trying to establish archaeology courses. They may make reference to some of the archaeology in their courses on the history of Tanganyika, for example, but they would form a very, very small part of those review courses that would focus much more on the history after 1800. Is still very common in many African history departments. These survey courses of the history of the nation, and it's established. It's largely through the efforts of Peter Schmidt, who manages, because he's doing his research in Tanzania at the time, he understands that the oil company, Caltex, the US oil company, Caltex, has some frozen assets within Tanzania, that they cannot repatriate a lot of the profits that they have within the country. And my understanding is that he is sufficiently able to sort of, I'm not quite sure whether he I think he does approach Nyerere. So I think he does eventually get to speak to the head man, so to speak. But certainly, what happens is that some of these funds from Caltex are used to provide the financial foundation for the archaeology unit, which still sits within the Department of History. And it was in this old building of the Faculty of Education that they had 3 offices, a lab space, and a small library. And that library was funded by these funds from Caltex, supplemented by an additional grant that Schmidt was able to get from the Ford Foundation. And then when this funding stream began to decline, we see new support coming in this case through the efforts of Randy Holland and NORAD money, Norwegian aid money, being used to support the running of the unit, including the paying of the salaries of 2 expatriate lecturers for, I think, a space of about 8 years. I was there for a couple of years under that latter phase of it. Today, of course, and it was during that period that the first generation or the new generation of Tanzanian archaeologists were trained, and all of them, I think, and I hope they wouldn't mind me saying this, all of them, I think, were very, very committed. It was interesting teaching there at that time, and they were all graduate students, so they were not yet on the lecturing staff. But in conversation with them, it was very, very clear that they saw that they had a particular responsibility to the nation state to return, because they were studying abroad, to return to Tanzania and to build archaeology in the country. And I think that was very much because they had been schooled at the height of these ideas of Nyerere-ism, if you like, of self-reliance and ujamaa. And that shapes, I think, the way in which archaeology is practiced by several of them as well. Once they return and once archaeology becomes more rooted in the curriculum at the University of Dar es Salaam. For a long time, however, they struggle with this relationship with the historians. And there is a lot of envy in the Department of History, certainly when I was teaching there, on the part of the historians that archaeology seemed to be relatively well resourced. We had an air conditioner, for example, in our library. We had the first computers. We had a library that the historians didn't. They had to rely on the university library. We had field vehicles. We had field equipment. And I think it could have been managed a little bit better and might have, but there was quite a lot of antagonism towards archaeology on the part of historians. And also, there was a sense that really archaeology didn't tell us anything about history. Though, curiously, I find it really surprising in a way that this department that was largely populated by African historians, not all Tanzanian, Wamba Wamba, whose name you may be familiar with or not. Professor Wamba Wamba was there from the Congo. We had colleagues from other parts of Africa who was also teaching on the staff, but it was largely Tanzanians. Abdul Sharif from Zanzibar. And they are actually almost buying into the Hegelian sort of idea of history as being about the text, and the importance of oral history as being a source of knowledge was already rapidly fading. And I think that there was a tension there that what, is material evidence a legitimate source of knowledge about the past? It is, archaeology is now a fully independent department of archaeology and heritage studies, and the picture below shows the building that was established. I'm rambling a little bit, and that's probably because I've still got to do a little bit more research and more thinking on these topics. But I think the trajectories that we see being played out in Tanzania and Ghana have been rather different. And I don't want to overemphasize this, but I think that the shift away in Tanzania of thinking about the origins of the Swahili as being of Arab origin, Persian origin, to one that is a locally initiated form of complex early urbanism, international trading. I think we see some signs in the writing of some East African archaeologists, a very, very strong sort of nationalist view and intake on the archaeology. I think it's a reaction in which against a strongly colonial view of that past. And I would not in any sense gainsay all of the arguments about Swahili being an African culture that absorbs foreign influences. But there is an element of a more sort of a nationalist position, and it, although it doesn't completely overwhelm the trajectory of archaeological research in Eastern Africa, I do think there's perhaps been a little bit of a disproportionate research on Swahili archaeology relative to the archaeology of other coeval groups further into the interior. So there is, in a sense, here that Swahili becomes, if you like, part of the national story. But as it becomes part of that national story, it also begins to obscure the contributions of non-Swahili groups to that national story. In contrast, I think we don't see that happening in Ghana, in Ghanaian archaeology. The obvious example would have been if we'd seen a massive investment in the archaeology of the Ashanti Kingdom. Yet actually, there's been remarkably little archaeological research on the Ashanti. More it's historians that sort of dominate and ethnographers who dominate that discourse rather than archaeologists. I think there is a contrast there. It's a subtle contrast. I wouldn't make too much of it, but I think there are some sort of intriguing lines that might be worth unpicking and merit some further research. So this is my last and concluding slide. I've tried to show that probably what I've tried to show, or I've best demonstrated, is a lot more research needs to be done on this topic, and somebody probably more competent than me, and more familiar than me with the writings of Africa's first independent leaders. I think they are a rich and underutilized resource that might help us understand a little bit about the contemporary context of archaeology and of history, for that matter, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And I would urge all of you to go back and look at some of this writing and try and think about, well, what were these individuals doing? How did they envisage the past could aid their aspirations for self-identity? There's a recent publication, well, it was published in 2018 in Azania by an Ethiopian archaeologist, Ashnafi Zena. And I didn't really get the time to sort of bring in a synopsis of the paper, but it's on the reading list that I've sent around. And it's interesting there that also he makes the argument that Menelik II, who was the founder of the modern Ethiopia, was actually also drawing on Ethiopia's Christian and medieval past, and he even apparently ordered and supervised excavations to try and locate Christian churches and some of the former royal mobile capitals as well. So it's clearly nationalist leaders don't necessarily have to come, be ones responding to European colonialism. In the Ethiopian case, this is an attempt to construct a nation state. In a way, maybe the Ethiopian case might be more a greater parallel with trajectories in 19th century Europe, for example. But then I just sort of leave you with this last thought. Given the importance that all of these sort of first generation of political leaders and independent nation states placed on recovering the African past, why is it that archaeology has not been elevated to and have much greater sort of status within both public discourse and within public consciousness? And just a final comment that I'm playing around with ideas that are still not yet properly crystallized in my own mind. But there you have a caption, and I thought, well, I'm talking to a group of people in Brussels, I should, evoke something Belgian. And having been brought up myself on Tantan, I have a lot of sort of, emotional attachment, I guess, to those storybooks. And here it is the Secret of the Unicorn that's been translated into Wolof, one of the major languages in Senegal. And anybody familiar with school education in Senegal until relatively recently will know, of course, that the curriculum was entirely dominated by French history and French heroes, and school kids read Tintin. Okay, it's not French, but whatever, and also Asterix. And I'm kind of thinking, what happens when actually the archaeology is in the vernacular? Perhaps if we're thinking about decolonizing the discipline, more attention has to be given to actually writing those archaeologies in local languages, sort of taking a lesson, if you like, from Ngugi's playbook. And on that point, I think I will end and thank you all very, very much for listening. And I'm happy to try to answer questions that are posed in French and try to answer them that are posed in English as well. Thanks very much. Now,